My name is Kaylee Foster. I am 28 years old. Last week I inherited $700,000 from my late father. Last night my stepfather demanded I hand every single penny over to him. He did not ask. He did not suggest. He slid a wire transfer authorization across the dining table and tapped a gold pen next to the signature line. My mother sat across from me sipping Chardonnay. She watched the man who erased my father from our lives try to take the last thing my father ever gave me. Then she reached out, touched my hand, and said the words that ended our relationship forever. "He is your family now, Kaylee. Your father would have wanted this." I did not scream. I did not cry. I picked up my purse and I walked out the door. They thought my silence was submission. They thought the quiet daughter was going to fold just like she always did. They had no idea that the money they were trying to steal was wired to a trap my father built for them 9 years ago. Carmel, Indiana, Sunday evening. The dining room table was set with silver and fine china. My mother Susan has always cared about the presentation of things, the appearance of wealth, the illusion of a perfect blended family. The pork roast she served was dry. I pushed it around my plate, trying to swallow the tension in the room. I had driven up from my apartment in Broad Ripple out of a sense of obligation. My 28th birthday was 4 days ago. Gary, my stepfather, did not call to wish me a happy birthday. Neither did his son Tyler. Gary poured himself another glass of expensive red wine. He leaned back in his leather chair, the chair that used to belong to my father. Gary runs a failing regional sporting goods franchise. I know it is failing because he spends more time complaining about his vendors than he does working. He cleared his throat and set his glass down on the mahogany table. "We need to talk about the trust, Kaylee." He said it with the casual authority of a boss giving a directive to an employee. He pulled a manila folder from the credenza behind him. He opened it and laid out the paperwork next to my dinner plate. The transfer forms, the routing numbers, the trust fund my father David set up for me matured on my 28th birthday. The money dispersed into a holding account. Gary had been tracking the date like a vulture. "The store is hitting a rough patch," he said, smoothing the paper with his thick hands. "Tyler needs his paycheck, and your mother needs her peace of mind. We are keeping the money in the family. We will call it a loan. You will get a return on your investment once the fourth quarter numbers pick up. A loan. $700,000 handed over to a man who refused to co-sign my student loans. A man who watched me eat off-brand oatmeal and work 50-hour weeks as a medical coder while he bought his own son a financed truck. I looked at my mother. I waited for her to step in. I waited for the woman who birthed me to protect my future. Susan adjusted her pearl necklace. She offered a tight, practiced smile. "Gary has a great business mind, sweetheart," she said. Her voice was syrupy sweet, coating a bitter pill. "We are a team. Families help each other." I stared at the dry pork on my plate. My father David was a careful man. An actuary. He calculated risk for a living. He worked his entire life to make sure I would be safe. And now the woman he loved was asking me to set my safety on fire to keep her new husband warm. "It is your father's money," my mother added, lowering her voice to that weaponized whisper. "He is your family now, Kaylee. Your father would have wanted this." I looked at the wire transfer form, the ink on the printed page, the audacity of the blank line waiting for my name. I felt the pulse in my neck, but my hands were steady. I did not argue. Arguing with Gary only fed his ego. I placed my cloth napkin on the table. I pushed my chair back and stood up. "I will think about it," I said. Gary narrowed his eyes. His jaw tightened. "There is nothing to think about, kiddo," he said. "The paperwork needs to be at the bank by Tuesday morning. Do not make this harder than it has to be." I turned and walked down the hallway. I heard my mother call my name, but her voice was flat and unconvincing. She did not follow me. She stayed at the table with the man who was actively trying to ruin my life. I stepped out into the cool evening air and unlocked my car. I put the keys in the ignition and gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The drive back to Indianapolis was going to be long, and I had a lot of work to do. The heater in my 2014 Honda Civic takes at least 10 minutes to blow anything resembling warm air. I merged onto Interstate 465 heading south away from the manicured lawns and gated driveways of Carmel. The steering wheel vibrated under my palms. The check engine light had been glaring at me for 3 days, but I had to ignore it until payday. In the cup holder, my phone buzzed against the plastic. The screen lit up the dark interior. A text from Gary, then a text from Susan, then another from Gary. I did not reach for it. I kept my eyes on the taillights ahead of me and let the cold air hit my face. I needed the chill to keep my mind sharp. I was 19 when the hospital called. It was a regular Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting in a university library studying for a biology exam. The voice on the other end of the line was clinical and precise. A ruptured brain aneurysm. 1 minute my father was reviewing a mortality table in his downtown office, and the next he was gone. David Foster was not a loud man. He was an actuary. He spent his entire adult life calculating risk, anticipating disaster, and building safety nets. He viewed the world through the lens of probability. He taught me to read a spreadsheet before I could ride a bike. He used to sit with me at the kitchen table tracing columns of numbers, with the end of his pencil telling me that numbers do not lie, but people often do. Susan did not wait long to prove him right. 11 months. That is exactly how long it took my mother to trade her mourning clothes for a white silk dress and a catered wedding reception at the Prairie View Golf Club. Gary did not just move into our house. He initiated a hostile takeover. The week after the wedding, I came home from my college dorm to grab my winter coats. I walked into the house and stopped dead in the hallway. My father's study was dismantled. The heavy oak desk he had built himself was gone. His leather-bound books, his framed degree, his meticulous filing cabinets were all missing. In their place sat a giant flat-screen television, a mini fridge, and a massive leather sectional. It was now a media room for Tyler. Tyler is Gary's son. He was 20 at the time, a year older than me. He walked around our house, leaving wet towels on the hardwood floors and eating out of cartons in the fridge like he had lived there his entire life. Any trace of the quiet, methodical man who actually paid for the house was scrubbed clean in a matter of days. Gary stood in the hallway holding a beer and clapped me on the shoulder, telling me it was time to embrace the new normal. The new normal had a steep price tag. My father had set up a college fund for me. I knew it existed because we reviewed the statements every January together. It was supposed to cover my tuition through a master's degree if I wanted one. But when the bill for my sophomore year arrived, my mother sat me down in the kitchen. She looked at her manicured nails, unable to meet my eyes. She explained that the family assets were currently tied up. Gary needed liquid capital to expand his sporting goods franchise into a neighboring county. Furthermore, the master bathroom needed a luxury renovation to fit the neighborhood aesthetic for the country club wives Susan hosted every month. My education was suddenly reclassified as an unnecessary expense. I was told to take out student loans. It builds character, Gary said. He was standing in the newly renovated kitchen, holding a golf putter, practicing his stroke on the expensive new tile. You have to earn your way in this world, kiddo. 2 weeks later, I watched through the living room window as Gary handed Tyler a set of keys to a brand new Ford pickup. The dealership tags were still on the bumper. Tyler was immediately hired as a regional manager at Gary's sporting goods store, despite having failed out of community college his freshman year. I was handed a stack of federal loan applications and told to figure it out on my own. I learned the hierarchy of the new Foster household very quickly. Tyler was the legacy. Gary was the patriarch, Susan was the enabler, and I was the ghost. I became the paperwork one, the daughter who took up as little space as possible. I learned to navigate around their country club dinners and weekend ski trips. I learned that my presence was an active inconvenience to the spotless blended family image my mother desperately wanted to project to her friends. If I asked for help with a car repair, I was being difficult. If I pointed out that Tyler wrecked his new truck and Gary quietly paid for the repairs out of pocket, I was being jealous. Over the years, I perfected the art of making myself invisible. People who look at me might think I am a pushover. They might look at how I sat at that dining room table tonight staring at the dry pork roast while a man tried to steal my inheritance, and they might say I am weak. They might think I lack a spine. But my silence at that table was never submission. It was a trauma response. It was the calculated action of a survivor who knows exactly how her abusers operate. You do not argue with people who only see your value in what they can extract from you. You let them talk. You let them reveal their hand. You let them dig their own graves. My phone buzzed again. The continuous vibration was starting to rattle the loose change in the cup holder. I finally picked it up at a red light on College Avenue. 6 new text messages. All from Gary. The tone was shifting. The first message was sent right after I walked out the door. "We are not done talking about this, Kaylee." The second message arrived 10 minutes later. "Do not be dramatic. We are trying to keep this business afloat for the family." The third message dropped the pretense of fatherly concern. "I spoke to the bank manager. We need that wire authorization signed by noon tomorrow. Do not make me come down there." The fourth and fifth messages were missed calls. The sixth message was the one that made my blood run cold. "Susan agrees with me. If you want to keep playing the victim and refuse to be a team player, we will have to reevaluate your place in this family. You either sign the papers or you are cut off." Cut off! The irony of the threat almost made me laugh out loud in the empty car. They had cut me off emotionally and financially the day Gary moved his golf clubs into my father's hallway. They had spent 9 years treating me like a stranger, and now they were threatening to abandon me if I did not hand over $700,000 to save a sinking ship. The light turned green. I pressed the accelerator. I did not text him back. I did not call my mother to beg for her understanding. My father taught me to calculate risk, and he taught me to read the fine print. Gary thought he had the upper hand because he was loud and demanding. He thought he could bully me into a financial corner, just like he bullied my mother into erasing my father's memory. But Gary made a critical error. He forgot that I am the daughter of an actuary. He forgot that I spent my entire life watching him make reckless decisions while I balanced my own checkbook to the penny. The money was sitting in a holding account waiting for my signature. Gary was pushing the timeline, demanding the transfer by noon tomorrow. He was desperate, and desperate people make mistakes. The continuous buzzing of the phone was not a sign of his power, it was a sign of his panic. I pulled into the cracked asphalt parking lot of my apartment building in Broad Ripple. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the pavement. I turned off the engine and sat in the dark, listening to the engine tick as it cooled down. The threat in Gary's last message hung in the air. He was going to push this until he got what he wanted, or until he broke me. I unlocked my door and stepped out into the night air. I knew what tomorrow would bring. I knew the quiet life I had built for myself was about to become a battleground. Monday morning started at 5:30. The radiator in my third-floor walk-up apartment groaned but produced no actual heat. I stepped onto the cheap linoleum floor of my bathroom and braced myself against the cold. Broad Ripple is a trendy neighborhood if you can afford the renovated bungalows. If you live in the brick apartment buildings tucked behind the main strip, it is just loud and drafty. I boiled water in a dented metal pot. I poured it over a bowl of generic store-brand oats. While the oatmeal softened, I sat on the edge of my mattress and threaded a needle. The hem of my black work trousers had unraveled last Thursday. I could not afford the $12 a tailor would charge to fix it. I pushed the needle through the cheap fabric, pulling the thread tight. This is what living on $43,000 a year looks like. Every single expense is a calculation. Every torn seam is a negotiation with the budget. I left for work at 6:45. The drive to the hospital administration building took 20 minutes in morning traffic. I work as a medical coder for a regional healthcare network. My job is to translate human physical suffering into alphanumeric sequences so insurance companies can decide whether or not to pay the bill. A fractured femur is one code, a denied claim is another. I spend 50 hours a week staring at dual monitors in a gray cubicle. I categorize other people's emergencies to pay for my own survival. Every month, I send $450 to a federal student loan servicer. The principal balance barely moves. Those are the loans Gary and Susan forced me to take out when they diverted my college fund to their country club lifestyle. I have spent the last 6 years grinding down that debt penny by painful penny. I pack my lunches, I skip the office coffee runs, I navigate the American healthcare maze from the inside, watching families go bankrupt over a single hospital visit. The $700,000 waiting in my holding account is not luxury money to me. It is not a vacation home or a new designer wardrobe. It is a life raft. It is the guarantee that I will never have to choose between a medical bill and a rent payment. It is the end of the low hum of panic that lives in the back of my throat every time I swipe my debit card at the grocery store. It is freedom. And Gary wants to use it to cover his bad business bets. I sat at my desk and logged into the hospital network. I set my phone face up next to my keyboard. The glass screen was cracked in the top left corner, a spiderweb of shattered glass I had been ignoring for 6 months. At 8:15, the screen lit up. Gary. Let us get the transfer paperwork rolling today. Family sticks together. I read the words and felt my stomach turn. Family sticks together. He used the word family like a weapon. He deployed it only when it served his bottom line. I clicked my mouse and opened my first patient file of the day. A complicated appendectomy. I began entering the surgical codes. 10 minutes later, the cracked screen lit up again. Gary, I need the confirmation number by noon, Kaylee. The bank is waiting. The juxtaposition was suffocating. I was sitting under fluorescent lights typing billing codes to earn $20 an hour. Gary was likely sitting in his leather office chair, sipping a premium dark roast coffee, demanding a 6-figure unearned bailout. He had never worked a 50-hour week in his life. He bought into that sporting goods franchise using my mother's equity. He coasted on the labor of his underpaid retail employees. Now that his incompetence had caught up with him, he expected me to write a blank check to fix it. I did not reply. I finished coding the appendectomy and moved on to a pediatric asthma case. At 9:30, my phone buzzed a third time. Susan. Please call Gary, sweetheart. He is very stressed. Tyler might lose his position at the store if the quarter does not turn around. My mother was using her own stepson as a human shield. Tyler spent his weekends driving his finance truck to tailgates and posting photos from VIP sections at downtown clubs. If Tyler lost his position at the store, he might actually have to apply for a job in the real world. I placed my phone face down on the desk. I needed to focus on the numbers on my monitor. The alphanumerics were safe. They followed rules. At 10:45, my desk extension rang. It was not a number I recognized from the hospital directory. I picked up the receiver expecting a claims adjuster. Are you ignoring me? Gary's voice barked through the earpiece. I froze. He had called my direct office line. He had never called me at work before. I looked over the cubicle wall. 2 of my coworkers were wearing their headsets, typing away oblivious to the invasion happening at my desk. I am working, Gary, I said, keeping my voice low and steady. You cannot call me here. I can call you wherever I need to call you. He snapped. His voice lacked the fake fatherly tone he used in front of Susan. I told you I need that wire confirmation by noon. I have suppliers breathing down my neck. You are putting the entire family business in jeopardy because you want to throw a tantrum. It is not a tantrum. It is my money, I said. It is family money, he shot back. And you are part of this family whether you act like it or not. I am trying to include you, Kaylee. I am trying to make you a partner. But if you are going to hold us hostage over a technicality, things are going to change. What technicality? I asked. The fact that your name is on the dispersal account, he said. It was an oversight by your father. He meant for that money to support your mother. I am the head of this household, and I am telling you to authorize the transfer. The sheer entitlement took my breath away. He was reducing a legally binding trust fund crafted by a meticulous actuary to a mere oversight. He was trying to rewrite history to suit his current financial crisis. I have to go back to work, I said. Listen to me very carefully. Gary lowered his voice to a menacing register. If you do not authorize that wire today, you are done. Do not expect to come to Thanksgiving. Do not expect your mother to answer your calls. If you are not a team player, you do not get the perks of being in the club. You will be cut out entirely. Think about that before you ruin your mother's life." He hung up before I could respond. The dial tone hummed in my ear. I slowly placed the receiver back on the cradle. I looked at the cracked screen of my cell phone. He had just threatened to sever my relationship with my mother over a business bailout. He had laid his cards on the table. He did not want a partnership. He wanted compliance. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a sudden, overwhelming clarity. Gary was pushing too hard. He was panicking. And when people panic, they expose their vulnerabilities. I opened a new browser tab on my computer. I typed in the name of the financial institution holding the trust. I navigated to the portal and logged in. I stared at the balance. $700,000. I looked at the withdrawal authorization form. I noticed something I had not paid attention to before. The transfer required more than just my digital signature. There was a secondary authorization clause, a requirement set up by the estate executor. I realized then that I did not fully understand the weapon my father had handed me. And if Gary was this desperate, I needed to know exactly what I was holding before I made my next move. I sat at a plastic table in the second-floor break room of the hospital. The vending machine in the corner hummed a low, constant drone. I had a lukewarm cup of break room coffee in one hand and my phone in the other. I was staring at the digital copy of my trust documents on the financial portal. Gary's phone call from an hour ago still rang in my ears, but the panic he tried to instill in me was gone. It had been replaced by a cold, sharp curiosity. I zoomed in on the withdrawal authorization form, the form Gary wanted me to sign by noon. There was a section at the bottom of the page buried under 3 paragraphs of legal boilerplate. It required a secondary authorization signature. It specifically named the original estate executor. The holding account was not a simple savings account waiting for a withdrawal slip. It was a restricted ledger. The $700,000 was sitting there, but the gate was locked. My mother's voice from Sunday night played on a loop in my head. "Your father would have wanted this." I took a sip of the bitter coffee. Susan was banking on the idea that I would let sentimentality override logic. But she was twisting the memory of a man who dealt exclusively in hard facts. David Foster did not operate on sentimentality. He built his entire career on predicting human failure. He calculated risk for life insurance policies. He knew exactly how often people got sick, how often they made bad choices, and how often they went bankrupt. He understood that money without parameters is a disaster waiting to happen. He also knew Gary. Gary was not a new addition to my mother's life after my father died. He was always hovering on the periphery. He was the flashy friend from the country club who always had a new business venture and a rented sports car. He was the guy who bought rounds of top-shelf liquor at the bar, but somehow always forgot his wallet when the tab arrived. My father despised him. I remember a Tuesday evening when I was 15 years old. My father was sitting at his oak desk reviewing a stack of investment portfolios. Gary had just left our house after trying to pitch my father on a commercial real estate flip. The pitch involved a strip mall, a lot of buzzwords, and zero actual capital from Gary himself. My father took off his reading glasses and looked at me. He pointed his silver pen at the front door. "That man is a walking liability, Kaylee," my father said. "He builds houses on sand and expects everyone else to pay for the concrete when they collapse." The cognitive dissonance of my mother's claim shattered completely in that break room. An actuary does not hand a lump sum of cash to a walking liability. A man who calculates risk for a living does not leave his only child unprotected if he knows his wife is prone to terrible financial choices. He would anticipate the exact scenario playing out right now. He would know that Gary would eventually drain Susan's accounts and come looking for mine. I kept scrolling through the digital document on my phone. The more I read, the more the pieces stopped fitting together the way Gary claimed they did. The money was dispersed into a holding account, but the holding account was tied to a corporate entity, a limited liability company. The name of the company was listed as DF Holdings, LLC. DF, David Foster. It felt too complex for a standard inheritance payout. A simple trust fund does not need an active corporate structure unless it is holding something other than just liquid cash. It was a maze designed by a man who loved puzzles. Gary thought he could bully me into authorizing a wire transfer. He thought the money was sitting in a bare trust waiting for my 28th birthday. He had not read the fine print. Or maybe he had read it and he was hoping I would not notice the secondary signature requirement. My phone vibrated against the plastic table. A new voicemail notification popped onto the screen, then a second one, then a third. Gary had stopped calling. He had deployed his best weapon instead, Susan. I tapped the screen and pressed the phone to my ear. I did not want to hear my mother's voice, but I needed to know her angle. "Kaylee, please pick up." Her voice was trembling. The audio was thick with tears. "Gary just showed me the ledger for the store. It is worse than he thought. If we do not inject capital by the end of the week, the suppliers are going to file a lien." I listened to her take a jagged breath. The performance was escalating. "Tyler will lose his job." She continued crying openly into the receiver now. "He has rent to pay Kaylee. He has a car note on that truck. He cannot afford an eviction." Gary is pacing the living room. His blood pressure is through the roof. "You are breaking this family apart over a signature. Please, sweetheart, call the bank. Do the right thing." The voicemail beeped and ended. I sat very still listening to the hum of the vending machine. The emotional blackmail had reached its peak. Susan was trying to drown me in guilt so I would not look at the math. She was prioritizing the car note of a 29-year-old man who spent his weekends at downtown clubs over the financial security of her own daughter. She was willing to let me bankrupt myself to save her husband from the consequences of his own incompetence. She used the word "we" when talking about the store failing. "We will lose everything." The concept of "we" never included me when they were remodeling the master bathroom or buying new vehicles. It only included me when the bill came due. 5 years ago, those tears would have worked. 5 years ago, I would have felt the crushing weight of responsibility for her happiness. I would have folded myself into a smaller shape to keep the peace in their pristine Carmel house. But I was not that girl anymore. I was a woman who read medical billing codes for 50 hours a week. I understood that every emergency has a root cause. The root cause of this emergency was Gary. I opened the second voicemail. It was more of the same. Susan talking about how hard Gary worked. Susan talking about how unfair the economy was to small business owners. Susan begging me to be a team player. She did not ask how my workday was going. She did not ask how I was sleeping. I was nothing more than a bank vault, and she was trying to pick the lock with a sob story. I deleted the voicemails. I closed the banking portal on my phone. The digital copies of the trust documents were not enough. I needed the original files. I needed the architecture of the trap my father had built. The secondary authorization clause clearly stated that the estate executor had to countersign any major liquidations. If I wanted to know the truth, I could not rely on Gary's frantic demands or my mother's weaponized tears. I needed to find the person who drafted the paperwork. My shift ended at 5 o'clock. I had 4 more hours of coding left. I stood up and threw my empty coffee cup into the trash bin. My hands were no longer shaking. The cold, sharp curiosity had solidified into a concrete plan. I knew where the original documents were. When my father died, the lawyer had handed me a sealed envelope. I was 19 years old and grieving. I had put the envelope in a fireproof lockbox and shoved it into the back of my closet. I had not looked at it in 9 years. I never needed to. Until today. I walked back to my cubicle and sat down in front of my dual monitors. I pulled up the next patient file. I typed the alphanumeric codes with perfect precision. My mind was entirely clear. Gary and Susan were relying on panic. They wanted a rushed decision. They wanted me to sign a blank wire transfer because they thought I was too intimidated to read the fine print. They were about to learn that ignoring the quiet daughter is a dangerous game. I was going to go home tonight. I was going to open that fireproof lockbox. I was going to find the name of the man my father trusted to execute his final wishes. The professional truth was waiting in a yellowed envelope, and I was finally ready to read it. My shift ended at 9 o'clock in the evening. The hospital parking garage was mostly empty, and the drive back to Broad Ripple was quiet. I navigated the dark streets, letting the rhythm of the traffic lights settle my nerves. I needed the quiet. I needed to think about the secondary signature requirement on the trust ledger. I pulled into the narrow alley behind my brick apartment building just before 9:30. The street lamp near the dumpster was burnt out, casting the small lot into deep shadow. I parked my Honda in my assigned space and turned off the ignition. I reached into the passenger seat to grab my work bag. That is when a pair of bright LED headlights flared to life directly in front of me. A silver Lexus SUV was parked illegally across two visitor spaces, blocking the exit of the alley. The driver's side door opened. Gary stepped out into the cold November air. He had not waited for tomorrow. He had driven 30 minutes south from Carmel to force the issue in person. He was wearing a tailored camel hair overcoat over his business suit, but the polished country club facade was cracking. He slammed his car door. The sound echoed off the brick walls of the alley. I locked my car and started walking toward the rear entrance of my building. I did not alter my pace. I kept my eyes focused on the metal handle of the security door. Kaylee, he barked my name across the asphalt. Stop walking. We are going to settle this right now. I did not stop. I reached the door and pulled out my key ring. Gary closed the distance faster than I expected. He stepped onto the concrete landing right behind me, invading my personal space. I could smell the sharp scent of his expensive cologne mixed with the distinct odor of stale scotch. He reached over my shoulder and placed his large hand flat against the metal door, holding it shut. You do not walk away from me when I am talking to you, he said. His breath plumed in the freezing air. I told you I needed that wire authorization signed today. You ignored my calls. You ignored your mother's voicemails. You are acting like a spoiled child. Remove your hand from the door, Gary, I said. My voice was low and level. He leaned closer. His face was red. The veins in his neck were visible under the collar of his expensive shirt. I am trying to save your family, he said. I have suppliers threatening to halt shipments tomorrow morning. I have payroll due on Friday. Your mother is sitting at home sick with worry because her daughter refuses to lift a finger to help us. I brought the printed forms. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded stack of papers. He shoved them toward my chest. Sign the papers, Kaylee, he demanded. I have a pen right here. We will sign them on the hood of my car, and I will leave you alone. This was a blatant violation of every boundary I had ever set. He had tracked me down at my home in the dark, trying to physically intimidate me into signing away my future. He relied on the assumption that a woman standing alone in a dark alley would fold under the pressure of a loud, angry man. He expected me to shrink. I looked down at the papers in his hand. Then I looked up at his flushed face. You need to leave my property, I said. He laughed. A short, bitter sound. Your property. You rent a shoebox in a bad neighborhood. You do not know the first thing about property or business. You are being selfish and hysterical over a technicality. You owe us this money after everything we provided for you. I shoved my key into the lock, turned the cylinder, and threw my shoulder against the heavy metal door. Gary stumbled backward, caught off guard by the sudden movement. I slipped inside the narrow hallway and let the security door slam shut behind me. The latch clicked into place just as Gary grabbed the exterior handle. He rattled the metal door. The sound echoed up the stairwell. Open this door, Kaylee, he shouted through the thick glass pane. Do not make me stand out here. I did not look back. I climbed the 3 flights of stairs to my apartment, taking the steps 2 at a time. My heart was hammering against my ribs, but my mind was entirely clear. I reached my floor, unlocked my apartment door, and stepped inside. I pushed the door shut and slid the heavy brass deadbolt into place. I engaged the chain lock for good measure. 30 seconds later, I heard heavy footsteps pounding up the wooden stairs. Gary had waited for another tenant to open the downstairs security door, and he had followed me up. He stopped outside my apartment. He hit the wood with the flat of his hand. 3 loud, heavy thumps. Kaylee, He shouted. His voice was muffled through the door, but the rage was unmistakable. You are making a huge mistake. If you do not sign these forms tonight, you will never see your mother again. I will make sure of it. You are dead to us. I stood in the center of my small living room. I did not turn on the lights. I let him yell. I let him pound on the wood. He called me ungrateful. He called me a failure. He used every word he could think of to break my resolve. He expected me to open the door crying and begging for his approval. He expected the quiet girl from the Carmel dining table to surrender. After 5 minutes, the yelling stopped. He muttered a final threat under his breath. I listened to his heavy footsteps retreat down the hallway and descend the stairs. A minute later, I heard the distant roar of his Lexus starting up in the alley. The silence returned to my apartment. It was heavy and thick. Gary had just forced my hand. He had crossed the line from manipulative stepfather to active threat. I walked into my bedroom and knelt on the floor. I reached into the back of my small closet and pulled out a heavy gray fireproof lockbox. I set it on the edge of my mattress and entered the 4-digit code. My father's birth year. The latch popped open. The box held my passport, my birth certificate, and a thick manila envelope sealed with wax. The envelope my father had instructed his attorney to hand me 9 years ago. I broke the wax seal. The paper was yellowed at the edges. Inside was a single sheet of heavy cardstock and a pristine white business card. I picked up the card. The black ink was sharp and formal. Thomas Gallagher, Estate Planning and Trust Law, Downtown Indianapolis. I carried the business card to my kitchen table. I opened my laptop. The clock in the corner of the screen read 11:42. I opened my email client and drafted a new message. I did not write an emotional plea. I did not complain about my mother or detail Gary's insults. I wrote the email like a medical coder documenting a complex patient chart, clinical, precise, methodical. Mr. Gallagher, my name is Kaylee Foster. David Foster was my father. My 28th birthday passed last week, and the holding account has matured. My stepfather Gary is currently attempting to liquidate the trust to cover commercial debts for his retail franchise. He has visited my home tonight to demand my signature. He is using my mother to apply coercion. I reviewed the digital ledger today and noticed the secondary authorization clause, requiring your signature. I need to know the exact parameters of the LLC my father created. I am requesting an urgent meeting. I read the text twice. It was factual. It left no room for misinterpretation. It was the quiet before the paperwork ambush. I clicked send. I closed the laptop and went to sleep. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm. The radiator was still cold. Outside, the sun had not yet risen over the brick buildings of Broad Ripple. At 6:15, my cell phone rang. It was not a text from Gary. It was an incoming call from a downtown Indianapolis area code. I cleared my throat and answered. Hello? Miss Foster. The voice on the other end was male. It was crisp, professional, and entirely unsurprised by the early hour. This is Thomas Gallagher. I sat up in bed. I sent you an email last night, I said. I read it 10 minutes ago, he replied. The tone of his voice carried the weight of a man who dealt exclusively in hard facts and ironclad contracts. I recognized the tone immediately. It sounded exactly like my father. Miss Foster, Gallagher continued his words, clipping the morning silence. I have been waiting for this phone call for 9 years. Can you be at my office by noon today? Yes, I said. I will be there. I ended the call. I looked around my cramped, drafty bedroom. For the first time in 9 years, the walls did not feel like a cage. They felt like a staging ground. The system my father built was finally awake. I walked into the bathroom and turned on the shower. I was done playing defense. I called my supervisor at the hospital and requested a half day, using the personal time I had been hoarding for a medical emergency. I did not explain the situation. I simply logged out of my workstation, grabbed my purse, and walked to the parking garage. The drive from the hospital into downtown Indianapolis took 30 minutes. The mid-morning traffic was light. The sky was overcast, casting a flat gray light over the city. I parked in a subterranean garage and took the elevator to the lobby of a glass and steel high-rise on Market Street. The law offices of Thomas Gallagher were located on the 19th floor. The elevator doors slid open to a reception area that felt entirely detached from the chaos of my life. There were no phones ringing. There were no loud voices echoing down the hallway. The air conditioning hummed a low, steady note. The floors were covered in thick, plush carpet that absorbed the sound of my footsteps. I stepped into the room, leaving the noise of Gary pounding on my apartment door far behind me. A receptionist offered me water in a heavy glass tumbler and led me down a long corridor paneled in dark wood. The contrast to the dirty alley behind my building in Broad Ripple was sharp. This was a place where emotions did not dictate the outcome. This was a place where math and law made the rules. Thomas Gallagher stood up behind his desk when I entered his office. He was a tall man with thinning gray hair, wearing a navy blue suit that looked meticulously pressed. His office smelled of old paper and leather bindings. A heavy mahogany desk anchored the center of the room. It was devoid of clutter. No family photos, no decorative knickknacks. Just a sleek laptop, a brass lamp, and a thick manila folder resting squarely on his blotter. He did not offer a warm, glowing smile. He extended a firm hand and gestured to a leather armchair opposite his desk. I sat down and placed my purse on the floor. Gallagher sat back down and folded his hands over the manila folder. It was identical in color and weight to the envelope sitting in my fireproof safe at home. He looked at me for a long moment, studying my face in the quiet room. "You look very much like your father," he said. His tone was observational rather than sentimental. I thanked him and waited. Gallagher did not waste time with small talk. He opened the folder and aligned the edges of the documents with the edge of his desk. "You sent me an email last night outlining a high-pressure scenario, Miss Foster," Gallagher said. "You stated your stepfather is attempting to liquidate the holding account. You stated your mother is applying emotional coercion to facilitate that transfer. You mentioned a midnight visit to your residence." "Yes," I said, keeping my voice level. "Gary is demanding I sign a wire transfer authorization by noon today. He claims his business will fail if I do not inject the capital. My mother is fully supporting his demand." Gallagher nodded slowly. He picked up a silver pen and turned it between his fingers. He told me that my father David was one of the most intelligent clients he had ever represented in his 30-year career. "Actuaries do not just calculate risk for insurance companies," Gallagher explained. "They view human behavior as a series of predictable statistical outcomes. Your father knew exactly what was going to happen after he died. He knew it before the aneurysm ever ruptured. He knew it because he was paying attention." Gallagher slid a piece of heavy paper across the mahogany surface. It was a copy of a limited liability company charter. The heading read DF Holdings, LLC. Gallagher explained that David had observed Susan's financial habits for years. My mother was always drawn to the appearance of wealth. She carried rolling balances on high-interest credit cards to fund country club luncheons and designer wardrobes. My father paid the bills quietly, but he tracked the data. He charted her spending. He recognized the pattern of chronic financial avoidance. He also tracked Gary. Gary was the loud, charismatic friend who was always hovering near Susan at social events long before my father passed away. My father recognized Gary as a financial parasite. He watched Gary fail at 2 separate business ventures, relying on other people's money to cover his heavy losses. My father ran the numbers on blended family asset depletion. The statistics in those scenarios are brutal. When a wealthy spouse dies, the surviving spouse often mismanages the inherited assets. If a predatory new partner enters the picture, the wealth is drained within 5 to 7 years. The children from the first marriage are almost always left with nothing. "Your father refused to let you become a statistic, Kaylee," Gallagher said, tapping his silver pen on the charter. "He knew if he left you a lump sum of cash, your mother would eventually come crying to you for a bailout. He knew Gary would eventually run out of other people's money and invent a crisis to get to yours. So David did not leave you a simple trust fund, he left you a corporate weapon." I looked down at the charter. The legal jargon was dense, but my background in medical coding trained me to find the vital information hidden in complex text. I scanned the paragraphs looking for the structure. The $700,000 sitting in that holding account is not an inheritance in the traditional sense. Gallagher continued. It is the liquid capital of a shadow corporation. You are the sole managing member of DF Holdings LLC, but the money is restricted by the operating agreement. Gallagher turned the page on his copy of the document. Turn to Section 4, subsection B, he instructed. I flipped the heavy page. My eyes scanned down the numbered list. The words jumped off the paper. The subsection outlined the exact protocol for external liquidation requests. It stated that any attempt to transfer capital out of the LLC for purposes unrelated to my direct health education or primary residence required the notarized signature of the estate executor. That was Gallagher. That was the secondary authorization I saw on the digital portal yesterday. But David did not stop there. Gallagher reached across the desk and pointed to a specific paragraph near the bottom of the page. Read this part aloud, Miss Foster, he said. I leaned closer to the document. The text was printed in crisp black ink. I cleared my throat and read the legal phrasing into the quiet room. In the event that Susan Foster, or any subsequent spouse of Susan Foster, including but not limited to Gary Miller, attempts to coerce, compel, or emotionally manipulate the beneficiary into liquidating trust assets, the executor is instructed to deny the transfer and activate the penalty clause contained in Addendum A. I stopped reading. The air in the room felt suddenly thin. I read the names again. Susan Foster, Gary Miller. My father had named him. My father had explicitly named the man who would try to steal from me 9 years before Gary ever stood in my alley and demanded my money. My father saw the betrayal coming from a decade away. The precision of it was staggering. It was not a generic legal protection. It was a targeted defense system. My father knew my mother would prioritize Gary over me. He knew Gary would eventually run his own retail businesses into the ground. He mapped out their failures with the same cold accuracy he used to map out mortality tables. Tears stung the corners of my eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of profound vindication. For 9 years I had felt crazy. I had watched my mother erase my father and replace him with a loud, incompetent man. I had endured the subtle insults, the stolen college fund, the constant pressure to make myself small, so Tyler could take up more space. I had questioned my own memory, wondering if my father was really the man I thought he was. Sitting in that leather chair, gripping the heavy paper, I realized my father was even smarter than I remembered. He had never left me alone. He had just been waiting in the fine print. Gallagher leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. Your father predicted this exact week, Kaylee, he said quietly. He knew they would come for the money. He knew they would use guilt to try and break you. He told me to wait until they backed you into a corner. He told me to wait until you asked for the truth. I looked across the mahogany desk. I am asking for the truth, Mr. Gallagher, I said. Gallagher nodded slowly. He closed the manila folder and reached into a deep desk drawer. He pulled out a second folder. This one was thinner. The label on the tab read, Addendum A. What I have just shown you is the shield your father built to protect the money, Gallagher said, placing the thin folder squarely in the center of the desk. But David did not just want to protect the money. He wanted to ensure they could never threaten you again. He did not just build a shield, he built a sword. I stared at the new folder. The hum of the central air conditioning seemed to fade into the background. Gary had spent last night pounding on my apartment door, threatening to cut me out of the family if I did not sign his wire transfer. He thought he held all the power. He thought I was just a medical coder living in a drafty walk-up, waiting to be bullied into submission. Open it, Gallagher said. It is time to talk about how your mother and Gary financed that big, beautiful house in Carmel. I stared at the thin folder resting on the mahogany desk. Addendum A. Gallagher did not open it immediately. He steepled his fingers and looked out the window at the gray Indianapolis skyline. The silence in the office was deliberate. He was giving me time to process the weight of the corporate shield my father had built before moving on to the sword. 8 years ago, my mother and Gary moved into their sprawling dream home in Carmel. I was 20 years old, navigating my junior year of college while drowning in federal student debt. I remember the first time I drove up to that house. It had a circular driveway flanked by pristine landscaping and a grand entryway with double mahogany doors. Susan hosted a catered housewarming party to show off the vaulted ceilings and the chef kitchen. Gary stood on the back patio holding a Scotch glass, accepting congratulations from the neighbors, as if he had built the brick structure with his own 2 hands. My mother told everyone that Gary had orchestrated a brilliant real estate deal. She bragged about his business acumen and his sharp negotiating skills. They projected an image of effortless wealth. I lived in a cramped dorm room eating dining hall leftovers, but I was expected to smile and play the role of the grateful daughter whenever I visited. Gallagher placed his hand on the thin folder. He broke the silence. "Your mother and Gary did not buy that house with a traditional bank loan, Miss Foster," he said. "They could not get one." I looked at him confused. Susan drove a luxury SUV. Gary wore tailored suits. They lived in one of the most expensive zip codes in the state. Gary is a walking liability. Gallagher continued echoing the exact phrase my father had used all those years ago. When they applied for a jumbo mortgage 8 years ago, Gary had a credit score that most banks consider toxic. He had a history of late payments, hidden tax liens from his previous failed ventures, and rolling credit card debt. No reputable financial institution was going to underwrite $1 million home for a man whose ledger was bleeding red. "Then how did they buy it?" I asked. "They used a private lending entity." Gallagher opened the folder and extracted a single stapled packet of legal-sized paper. Gary considered himself a creative financier. When the traditional banks rejected him, he sought out alternative funding. He found a private servicing company willing to front the capital for the Carmel property at a slightly higher interest rate. Gary was so desperate to secure the house and prove his worth to your mother that he jumped at the offer. He handled the paperwork. He orchestrated the workaround. Susan just signed on the dotted lines he pointed to. Gallagher slid the packet across the desk. It was a copy of a recorded mortgage deed filed with the Hamilton County Clerk's Office. "Gary never read the fine print," Gallagher said. His voice was clinical. If he had read the fine print, he would have looked past the name of the servicing company processing his monthly payments. He would have noticed the actual registered entity funding the loan. I looked down at the document. My eyes scanned past the property address and the legal description of the lot. I found the section defining the borrower and the lender. Borrower, Susan Miller and Gary Miller. Lender, D.F. Holdings, LLC. I stopped breathing. The letters blurred for a fraction of a second before snapping back into sharp focus. D.F. Holdings, LLC. The limited liability company funded by my father's trust. The company that I now controlled as the sole managing member. "My father's money," I whispered. "Your father's money," Gallagher confirmed. David knew they would try to buy a house they could not afford. He instructed me to set up a blind trust broker before he passed away. We waited for Gary to hit a wall with the traditional banks. When he started hunting for private capital, we simply made sure our servicing company offered him the most attractive terms. Gary thought he had outsmarted the system. He thought he had secured a brilliant loophole to fund his country club lifestyle. Gallagher leaned forward, resting his elbows on the mahogany surface. "Legally speaking, Miss Foster, your trust holds the primary mortgage on their Carmel property. David orchestrated it so his money funded their lifestyle, but he kept the leash firmly in his own hands. And the leash is very short." I traced the edge of the mortgage deed with my index finger. The sheer scale of my father's foresight was staggering. He had not just protected my future, he had purchased the ground beneath their feet. Every time Gary walked across those imported hardwood floors, he was walking on my property. Every Sunday roast my mother cooked in that chef kitchen was prepared in a room I legally financed. They treated me like a financial burden for 9 years while paying a monthly mortgage directly into my trust account. "Turn to page 4, Gallagher instructed. I turned the heavy pages. The legal terminology was dense, but Gallagher guided my attention to a specific subclause under the terms of repayment. This is a private promissory note, Gallagher explained. Standard mortgages operate on a fixed amortization schedule. You pay every month for 30 years until the debt is cleared. But private notes often include specific performance contingencies. Your father included an acceleration clause. I work with medical billing structures. I understand the concept of accelerated debt. It means the lender has the right to demand the entire outstanding balance of the loan immediately if the borrower violates a specific condition of the contract. Read the condition for acceleration, Gallagher said. I read the text out loud, letting the words fill the quiet office. The lender reserves the right to declare the entire unpaid principal balance and all accrued interest immediately due and payable if the borrower, or any dependents of the borrower, engage in documented financial coercion, harassment, or legal contestation against the primary beneficiary of DF Holdings, LLC. I looked up from the paper. My heart was beating in a slow, steady rhythm. The puzzle pieces clicked together with flawless precision. Financial coercion, I said. Yes, Gallagher said. A standard default happens when someone stops paying their monthly bill. Your father redefined default. He stipulated that if Gary or Susan ever tried to bully you out of your trust fund, the penalty would not be a polite legal warning. The penalty would be the immediate acceleration of their mortgage. What is the outstanding balance on the house? I asked. Gallagher glanced at a ledger on his laptop screen. They have been paying the minimum interest for 8 years. The balloon payment currently stands at $480,000. $480,000. Gary was currently failing to make payroll for his sporting goods store. He was desperate for my $700,000 just to keep his suppliers from locking his doors. He did not have $500,000 sitting in a checking account. If we trigger this clause, I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level, how long do they have to pay the balance? 30 days, Gallagher replied. 30 days from the date of formal notice. If they fail to secure $480,000 by the deadline, DF Holdings, LLC has the right to initiate immediate foreclosure proceedings. We take the house. The silence returned to the office. It was not a heavy silence. It was the sound of a cage door swinging open. For 9 years, I had tiptoed around Gary's explosive temper and my mother's weaponized guilt. I had eaten generic oatmeal and sewn my own clothes while they hosted catered parties on my father's dime. They thought I was weak. They thought I was just the quiet medical coder they could bully in a dark alley. They had no idea that I did not just hold the keys to my own future. I held the deed to their illusion. Gallagher closed his laptop. The legal mechanism is sound, Miss Foster, he said. But an acceleration clause requires proof of the triggering event. The court will not enforce a balloon payment based on a feeling. We need documented evidence of financial coercion. We need proof that Gary crossed the line. I reached into my purse. I pulled out my cell phone with the shattered glass in the top corner. I unlocked the screen and opened my text messages. I placed the phone on the mahogany desk and slid it across the smooth wood toward Gallagher. I have 12 text messages demanding a wire transfer by noon today, I said. The last one explicitly threatens to cut me out of the family if I do not comply. I also have 3 voicemails from my mother detailing Gary's failing business and begging me to liquidate my trust to save his store. And last night, Gary ambushed me at my apartment building. He trapped me at my security door and demanded I sign a blank wire authorization form in the dark. Gallagher looked at the cracked screen of my phone. He read the messages silently. He did not smile, but the tension in his shoulders relaxed. This is more than enough, Gallagher said. This is a textbook definition of financial coercion. Gary documented his own extortion. I looked out the window at the gray sky. The fear that had lived in my chest since I was 19 years old was gone. It had been replaced by a cold, clinical resolve. Gary thought he was going to walk away with my $700,000 today. He thought he had me cornered. Mr. Gallagher, I said, turning my attention back to the architect of my father's trap. I want to draw up the formal notice of acceleration. I want to gather the LLC charter, the recorded deed, and the text messages. I need everything printed, compiled, and placed in a manila envelope. Gallagher pulled a fresh notepad toward him. "Where would you like the notice delivered?" he asked, clicking his silver pen. "They are coming to my apartment tonight," I said. "Gary expects me to sign his wire transfer. I am going to hand him the envelope instead." I left Thomas Gallagher's office shortly after 1 in the afternoon. The thick manila envelope sat on the passenger seat of my Honda Civic. It felt heavier than a stack of paper should feel. It held the accumulated weight of 9 years of silent endurance. I did not return to the hospital to finish my coding shift. I drove straight back to Broad Ripple, taking the surface streets instead of the highway. The check engine light was still glaring from the dashboard, but it did not register as a crisis anymore. A blinking dashboard light is a minor maintenance issue. The real crisis was sitting in a leather chair in Carmel, and I was about to handle it. I rolled down the window and let the cold air hit my face. My mind was racing, but it was not spinning out of control. It was organizing facts. I walked up the 3 flights of stairs to my apartment. I unlocked the deadbolt and stepped inside. The radiator was quiet, leaving the rooms chilly and still. I did not turn on the television. I did not put on any music. I needed absolute silence to focus on the task ahead. I walked into the kitchen and cleared my small table. It is a cheap laminate table I bought at a thrift store when I first moved out of the college dorms. It wobbles if you lean on it too hard. It is a far cry from the heavy mahogany dining table in Carmel, where Gary carved dry pork roast and dictated my future. But this laminate table was mine. I paid for it with my own wages. And it was going to serve as the staging ground for the end of their illusion. I opened the envelope Gallagher provided. I took out the pages and began laying them flat on the table in a precise row. I approached the task just like I do when I am auditing a complex medical chart at the hospital. You do not look at the emotion of a chart. You do not get distracted by the noise or the panic of the patient. You look at the billing codes. You look at the concrete evidence. My father used to organize his desk this exact way. He would line up his actuarial tables edge to edge until the math told a clear story. I was doing the same thing. Document 1 went on the far left. The Limited Liability Company Charter, DF Holdings, LLC, the legal foundation my father laid. I traced his printed name on the establishing line with my index finger. He formed the entity 3 months before the aneurysm ruptured. He built the structure quietly while Gary was busy drinking scotch and bragging about real estate deals that did not exist. The charter was the bedrock. It proved the money was never a simple gift. Next to the charter, I placed document 2, the recorded mortgage deed filed with Hamilton County. I took a yellow highlighter from the pencil cup on my counter. I uncapped it and drew a bright, crisp line across the section, identifying DF Holdings, LLC, as the primary lending institution. I drew a second line across the signatures of Susan Miller and Gary Miller at the bottom of page 3. They signed their names in blue ink right below a clause they never bothered to read. The ink strokes looked rushed. Gary probably told my mother to just sign the paperwork so they could pick up the keys to their dream house and host their first country club dinner. He was too arrogant to verify the lender. Document 3 went in the center of the table. The private promissory note containing the acceleration clause. I highlighted the exact phrase detailing the penalty for financial coercion. The fluorescent light above my kitchen sink flickered, casting a sterile glow over the highlighted yellow text. $480,000 due in 30 days. The math was elegant. It was undeniable. It was a trap made of ink and paper waiting to snap shut. On the far right, I placed document 4. This was a new addition we finalized in the office. Gallagher had printed high-resolution screenshots of my cell phone log. He had also generated a certified transcription of the 3 voicemails my mother left me earlier that morning. It was a physical record of their extortion attempt. The text messages demanding a wire transfer by noon. The threats from Gary promising to cut me out of the family if I did not comply. The midnight visit to my alleyway. It was all laid out in black and white formatting. It was a paper trail of their greed, and it satisfied the burden of proof required by the acceleration clause. While I was highlighting the final signature block, my cell phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. The caller ID flashed my mother's name. I did not answer. I let it ring. It went to voicemail. 2 minutes later, the notification tone sounded. I pressed play and put the phone on speaker, setting it down next to the stack of evidence. "Kaylee, sweetheart." My mother's voice drifted through the small kitchen. It dripped with relief and syrupy sweet promises. "Gary said he spoke to you last night and you are getting the paperwork together today. We are proud of you for being a team player. We know you are doing the right thing for the family. Gary wants to take us all out to that expensive steakhouse downtown this weekend to celebrate. We are going to get the store back on track, and you will get a great return on your investment. Call me when the wire is confirmed. We love you." I stared at the cheap linoleum floor. She was offering me a steak dinner in exchange for $700,000. She was offering conditional love packaged as a business transaction. 5 years ago, that voicemail might have made me second-guess myself. I might have convinced myself that buying their approval was worth the cost. Today, it just sounded hollow. The price of admission to their family was my financial ruin, and I was no longer willing to pay it. I did not call her back. I continued reviewing the documents, cross-checking the dates and the notarized stamps. 45 minutes passed. The phone vibrated again. My mother calling a second time. Again, I let it go to voicemail. This time, the tone of the message shifted. The syrupy sweetness evaporated, leaving behind a cold, sharp disappointment. "Kaylee, do not play games with us today." Her voice was clipped and demanding. "Gary is pacing the floor. The noon deadline passed and the bank has not seen a wire confirmation. If you are holding this up out of spite, you are making a grave mistake. We need this resolved now. Call Gary immediately." I deleted the voicemails. They had served their purpose. They confirmed that Gary and Susan were operating under the delusion that they had won. They thought my silence was the silence of a frightened girl scrambling to gather bank forms. They mistook my methodical preparation for submission. They thought I was sitting in my apartment trying to figure out how to wire the funds. I picked up my phone and opened my message thread with my mother. I typed a single text message. I did not use exclamation points. I did not offer explanations. I channeled the clinical precision of Thomas Gallagher. "I have the final paperwork regarding Dad's money. Come to my apartment tonight at 7 p.m. Bring Gary." I hit send. I did not have to wait long. 3 minutes later, a text came back from Gary's phone. "We will be there. Have a pen ready." I put the phone in my pocket. I looked down at the laminate table. The 4 documents were arranged in a perfect sequence. I was not a scared medical coder hiding in a dark parking lot anymore. I was the successor trustee of DF Holdings LLC. The trap was armed and the bait was set. They were coming to my apartment, expecting to walk away with a fortune of unearned capital. They expected me to hand over my future to fund their present. Tonight, they would learn who held the deed to their lives. The buzzer to my apartment rang at exactly 7 o'clock. I was standing in the center of my small living room looking at the thrift store coffee table. I had cleared away my magazines and my coffee mug. The surface was bare. The radiator hissed in the corner, fighting a losing battle against the November draft leaking through the window frames. I walked to the intercom panel on the wall and pressed the unlock button for the downstairs security door. I did not speak into the speaker. I listened to the heavy metal door clank open 3 floors below. Then came the sound of footsteps on the wooden stairs. 2 sets of feet, one light and rhythmic, the other heavy and labored. Gary was not used to climbing 3 flights of stairs. He preferred elevators and valet parking. I opened my apartment door before they could knock. Gary stood in the hallway, breathing hard through his nose. He was wearing a tailored navy blue blazer with brass buttons over a crisp white dress shirt. The fabric looked expensive. It was the kind of jacket men wear to country club dinners to signal their success to the rest of the room. He looked entirely out of place, standing on the frayed carpet of my apartment hallway. Susan stood next to him wearing a cream-colored cashmere wrap. Her hair was perfectly styled, Her makeup was flawless. She smelled of a high-end floral perfume that immediately overpowered the faint smell of cleaning supplies in my apartment. They walked past me without waiting for an invitation. Susan shivered, rubbing her arms through the cashmere. "It is freezing in this hallway, Kaylee," she said, looking at the water stain on the ceiling near my doorway. "We really need to talk about getting you into a better building. This neighborhood is getting so run down." I closed the door and locked the deadbolt. I did not point out that she had not cared about my neighborhood for the last 5 years. I did not remind her that I lived in this building because they diverted my college fund, forcing me to spend my income on student loan payments. I simply turned around and watched them invade my space. Gary held out a brown paper bag. "I picked this up on the drive down," he said. "A peace offering, to celebrate." I took the bag and pulled out the bottle. It was a generic red wine blend with a colorful label. I recognized it from the bottom shelf of the local grocery store. It retailed for $12. Gary was asking me to hand over a $700,000 trust fund to save his failing business, and he thought a $12 bottle of wine was an appropriate gesture of gratitude. It was a performative insult. It proved he did not respect my intelligence. He viewed me as a transaction that he had successfully negotiated for pennies. I placed the unopened bottle on the kitchen counter. I did not offer them glasses. Gary moved into the living area. He did not sit in the armchair. He sat right in the middle of my small sofa, spreading his arms across the back cushions. He stretched his legs out, taking up as much physical space as the room would allow. He was reclaiming his territory. He was playing the role of the alpha male who had successfully disciplined a rebellious subordinate. Susan sat next to him, perching on the edge of the cushion. She beamed at me. The tension from her voicemails earlier that morning had vanished. She was playing the role of the relieved matriarch. "I am so glad we are doing this, Kaylee," Susan said, resting her manicured hand on Gary's knee. "Gary told me you two had a productive talk last night. I knew you would come around. I told him you just needed time to process the numbers. This is going to fix everything." I remained standing. I folded my arms and looked down at them. I let them talk. I wanted them to dig the hole as deep as possible. I wanted to observe their complete lack of remorse before the trap snapped shut. Gary leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He laced his fingers together and adopted a serious business expression. He was ready to deliver his pitch. "The market has been tough on retail this year, kiddo," Gary said, using his patronizing nickname for me. "Supply chains are a mess. Consumer spending is down. The sporting goods sector requires a lot of overhead. I have been keeping the ship afloat, but we hit a cash flow bottleneck. That is all this is. A temporary bottleneck." He unlaced his fingers and gestured to the empty air in front of him, painting a picture of future wealth. "With this capital injection, we can clear our vendor debts by Friday," he continued. "Tyler is going to take over the regional marketing campaign next month. We are going to rebrand. We are going to optimize our inventory. This money is not just paying bills, Kaylee. It is working for the family. You are making an investment in our legacy." I watched his mouth move. I listened to the buzzwords: capital injection, optimize, legacy. He was stringing together corporate jargon to mask the fact that he was a failure. He had mismanaged his inventory. He had alienated his suppliers. He had put his unqualified son in a management position. The store was not failing because of the economy. The store was failing because Gary was running it, and you will get a great return on investment, Gary added, flashing a bright, confident smile. "Once our fourth quarter numbers stabilize, we will set up a repayment schedule. You will end up with more money than you started with. It is a win for everybody." Susan nodded eagerly. "We are a team, sweetheart," she said. Her eyes were wide and earnest. "Your father would be so proud to see us working together like this. He always wanted us to take care of each other." That was the final shovel of dirt. She was using the ghost of my father to validate a financial crime. She was asking me to betray the man who actually protected me in order to fund the man who replaced him. She felt no guilt. She felt no shame. She only felt relief that her country club lifestyle was no longer in jeopardy. I did not say a word. I kept my face entirely blank. Gary took my silence as a cue to close the deal. He reached inside his tailored blazer and pulled out a folded document. He smoothed it out and placed it squarely in the center of the cheap coffee table. It was a bank wire transfer authorization form. It bore the logo of a national financial institution. The routing numbers were already typed into the recipient boxes. The amount line was filled out in Gary's distinct handwriting. $700,000. All that remained was the empty signature line at the bottom of the page. Gary reached into his inside pocket again. He pulled out a heavy gold pen. He clicked the top with his thumb. The metallic sound was sharp in the quiet room. He leaned over the table and tapped the tip of the gold pen right next to the blank signature line. He looked up at me. The fake fatherly smile fell away, revealing the cold, calculating greed underneath. He was treating me exactly like a bank teller. "Sign on the dotted line, kiddo," Gary said. His voice was flat and commanding. I looked at the white paper resting on my thrift store table. I looked at the gold pen. I looked at the man who had spent the last 9 years making me feel small. He thought the negotiation was over. He thought the quiet daughter had surrendered. I took a step forward. I did not reach for the gold pen. I reached out and placed my index finger on the edge of the wire transfer form. I slid the paper across the laminate surface, pushing it far away from the center of the table. Gary frowned. His hand hovered in the air holding the pen. "What are you doing?" he asked, the irritation bleeding back into his voice. I ignored his question. I reached down beside the leg of my armchair. I picked up the thick manila envelope that Thomas Gallagher had prepared for me in the mahogany office downtown. The paper was heavy and dense. I stepped back to the table. I placed the manila envelope directly over the spot where the wire transfer form had been resting. "I am not signing that," I said. My voice was calm and measured. "But you need to read this." I placed my hand flat on top of the heavy manila envelope. I pushed it across the laminate surface of the coffee table. The paper made a soft scratching sound against the cheap wood. It stopped directly in front of my mother. "I am not signing that wire transfer," I said. My voice was even. It did not shake. "But you need to read this." Gary let out a short, dismissive scoff. He shifted his weight on the cheap sofa, causing the worn springs to creak underneath him. "What is this?" he demanded. More delays. He reached his thick hand across the table to intercept the envelope. He wanted to maintain control of the physical space, just like he always did in their sprawling Carmel home. He was used to dictating the terms of every interaction. He assumed I was handing over some kind of medical bill or a list of my own meager expenses to justify keeping my money. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch. I simply locked my eyes onto his and held the stare. It was a cold, clinical gaze, the kind of look a medical professional gives a disruptive patient in a waiting room. Gary stopped. His hand hovered over the paper. The sudden shift in my demeanor broke his rhythm. He was used to the quiet daughter who looked at the floor and apologized for existing. He was not prepared for a woman who looked right through him. He pulled his hand back and adjusted his expensive tailored blazer, pretending he had changed his mind. "Let her look at it," he muttered, "if it makes you feel better." Susan looked at Gary and then at me, her brow furrowed in confusion. The syrupy smile had faded from her face. She reached out with her manicured fingers and lifted the flap of the envelope. She pulled the stack of papers out and rested them on her lap. The room went entirely silent. The only sound was the faint hum of traffic down on the street and the hiss of the radiator in the corner. I stood there and watched the woman who had watched me eat off-brand oatmeal while she drove a luxury vehicle. I watched her read the architecture of her own downfall. Susan looked at the first page. It was the limited liability company charter. I watched her eyes dart back and forth across the printed text. She read the heading, DF Holdings, LLC. She did not understand what she was looking at. Her eyes glazed over the corporate jargon and the establishing dates. She flipped to the second page, searching for something familiar. Gary sighed loudly, shifting his weight again. Just tell us what it says, Kaylee, he complained. We do not have time for a reading assignment. I have a business to save. Tyler is waiting for a phone call to know if he still has a job tomorrow. I ignored him. I kept my eyes fixed on my mother. I wanted to witness the exact second the math clicked into place. Susan reached the second document, the recorded mortgage deed filed with Hamilton County. She recognized the format of this paper. It was the exact same packet of documents she had signed at a mahogany table 8 years ago when she bought her dream home. She traced her manicured finger down the side of the page. She found the highlighted yellow line. Lender, DF Holdings, LLC. I watched the reality register in her brain. It was a rapid physical transformation. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin pale and drawn. Her breathing turned shallow. She looked at her own signature in blue ink at the bottom of the page right next to the name of the entity my father created. She flipped to the third document, the private promissory note. Her eyes found the second highlighted section, the acceleration clause. Her hands began to tremble. The heavy paper shook in her lap. The illusion she had built for herself was crumbling right in front of my eyes. What is it? Gary asked. He leaned over, trying to look at the papers in her lap. Susan, what are you reading? Susan could not speak. Her throat was paralyzed. She looked up at me, and her eyes were filled with a dawning horror. So I spoke for her. I used the exact legal phrasing Thomas Gallagher taught me in his downtown office. I delivered the words with the rhythm of a metronome. Each sentence was a precise strike. 8 years ago, Gary could not secure a traditional bank loan for your house in Carmel, I said. His credit was toxic. He found a private lending company to underwrite the mortgage. He did not read the fine print. He did not verify the origin of the capital. He just wanted the keys to the house so he could pretend he was a successful businessman. Gary frowned. His face darkened with rising anger. What are you talking about? He demanded. We pay our mortgage every month to a servicing agency. I set that deal up myself. What does this have to do with your trust fund? I kept my focus entirely on Susan. The servicing agency is a blind front, Mom, I continued. The registered lending entity funding your private mortgage is DF Holdings, LLC. It is a corporate shell created by Dad 3 months before he died. The $700,000 sitting in my account is the liquid capital of that shell. It is the money you have been paying interest on for 8 years. Gary froze. The irritation on his face morphed into a stunned blank stare. He looked from me to Susan and back again, trying to process the magnitude of the legal snare. Dad knew Gary was going to run his businesses into the ground, I said. The volume of my voice was normal, but the words hit harder than a scream. He knew Gary would eventually come looking for my inheritance to cover his debts. He knew you would enable him and use the word family to justify the theft. So Dad did not just leave me a standard trust fund, he became your bank. I am the sole managing member of DF Holdings, LLC. I own the primary mortgage on your house. Susan gasped. It was a sharp, ragged intake of air. She dropped the papers onto the coffee table. They fanned out across the laminate surface. The highlighted yellow lines glowed under the cheap apartment lighting. The reality of her situation was printed in undeniable black ink. But Dad went one step further, I said, leaning forward slightly to make sure she heard every single syllable. I pointed to the third document resting on the table. Private notes contain specific performance contingencies. Dad included a penalty clause to ensure you could never touch my money. It states that if you or your dependents ever engage in documented financial coercion against me, the lender has the right to accelerate the debt. That is illegal, Gary stammered. His voice cracked. He reached for the papers with a shaking hand. You cannot do that. We have rights. We pay our bills on time. You cannot just call in a loan because you are angry. You have a balloon payment, I corrected him, and you just triggered it. I reached over and tapped the fourth document on the table. The printed screenshots of Gary's aggressive text messages and the certified transcripts of Susan's manipulative voicemails. I pointed to the printed words outlining their threats. Threatening to cut me out of the family if I do not wire you $700,000 is the legal definition of extortion. Showing up at my door in the middle of the night demanding a signature is financial coercion. You documented your own default, Gary. You gave me all the proof I needed in writing. I looked directly into my mother's wide, terrified eyes. She was finally seeing the consequence of choosing a parasite over her own child. Dad did not just leave me money, Mom, I said. He left me the deed to your house, and because Gary could not stop harassing me, you just triggered the clause. Susan dropped the papers. They fluttered down onto the cheap laminate coffee table, scattering across the surface. She raised both of her manicured hands to her mouth. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the yellow highlighted text, as if staring at a physical threat. Then the dam broke. For my entire life, I had seen my mother cry. I had seen her cry when the country club raised their membership dues. I had seen her cry when a contractor installed the wrong shade of granite in her kitchen. I had seen her cry on voicemails to manipulate me into compliance. But those were performative tears. Those were tears deployed as a tool to bend the world to her will. This was different. This was raw, unfiltered terror. A ragged sob tore from her throat. It was an ugly sound devoid of any grace or pretense. The polished, affluent facade melted away, leaving behind a panicked woman, realizing the foundation of her life had just collapsed. The $700,000 bailout she had banked on to save her lifestyle vanished into the ether. It was instantly replaced by a $480,000 debt hanging directly over her head, a debt she had no means to pay. Kaylee, she choked out the words barely audible over her ragged breathing. You cannot do this. We will lose the house. Where will we go? I stood perfectly still, watching her unravel. I did not feel the urge to comfort her. I did not feel the sudden rush of guilt that she had spent decades training me to feel. I felt a profound clinical detachment. She was facing the mathematical consequence of her own choices. Gary did not share my detachment. He lunged forward and snatched the papers off the coffee table. His thick fingers crumpled the edges of the limited liability charter. He stared at the text, his eyes darting across the paragraphs, searching for a loophole, a mistake, an exit route. He found nothing but airtight legal structure. The mask of the caring, concerned stepfather shattered completely. The tailored blazer and the expensive cologne could no longer hide the reality of the man underneath. He was a cornered predator, realizing he had just stepped onto a bear trap. His face flushed a deep mottled purple. The veins in his neck bulged against his collar. This is a fraud, he roared. The sheer volume of his voice echoed off the thin walls of my apartment. He threw the papers back onto the table. The pages scattered, sliding off the edge and onto the floor. You forged this, he shouted, pointing a thick finger directly at my face. You forged these documents. David did not set this up. You went to some cheap lawyer and printed this garbage to try and extort us. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked at the spittle flying from his mouth as he screamed. His reaction was entirely predictable. When a narcissist is stripped of their power, they do not concede defeat. They escalate. They attack the source of the truth. I did not forge a recorded mortgage deed filed with Hamilton County 8 years ago, Gary Weiss replied. My voice remained steady, the volume normal. The contrast between my calm demeanor and his explosive rage was stark. You signed it yourself. You were too arrogant to read the name of your own lender. You thought you found a loophole. You found a leash instead. He paced the length of my small living room, his heavy boots thudding against the floorboards. He was a caged animal looking for a way out. I am calling the police, he threatened, pulling his cell phone from his pocket. I am calling the police right now. This is elder abuse. You are trying to steal our home. You are a criminal, Kaylee. You are going to jail for this. Call them, I offered, gesturing toward the phone in his hand. Call the police, Gary. Tell them you showed up at my apartment last night and trapped me at my door to demand a $700,000 wire transfer. Tell them you left voicemails threatening to cut me out of the family if I did not pay your commercial debts. Tell them you are angry because the trust fund you tried to steal actually owns the house you live in. Let us see how the authorities interpret financial coercion. He stopped pacing. His thumb hovered over the screen of his phone. He realized the trap extended beyond the paperwork on the table. He had documented his own extortion. The text messages and voicemails were undeniable proof. He shoved the phone back into his pocket. His chest heaved with exertion. He turned his anger back toward Susan. "Do something," he barked at her. His voice was ragged. "This is your daughter. Fix this. Tell her to drop this nonsense right now." Susan flinched at the sound of his voice. The dynamic between them was shifting. The polished partnership they projected to the world was fracturing under the pressure of the debt. She looked up at him, her mascara running down her cheeks, leaving dark streaks on her flawless makeup. "What can I do, Gary?" she sobbed. The tears were flowing freely now. "She has the deed. David planned this. He knew you were going to ruin us." The accusation hung in the air. Susan was finally vocalizing the truth she had ignored for 9 years. Gary's incompetence had cost them everything. Gary spun around to face me again. He abandoned the threat of the police. He abandoned the accusation of forgery. He resorted to the only tactic he had left: pure, unadulterated intimidation. "You think you are so smart?" he sneered, stepping closer to me. His physical presence was meant to be imposing. "You think you can outplay me with a piece of paper? You are nothing, Kaylee. You are a medical coder living in a dump. You do not have the money to fight me in court. I will tie this up in litigation for years. I will bleed you dry with legal fees. You will never see a dime of that trust fund." I stood my ground. The intimidation tactic was hollow. He was projecting his own financial ruin onto me. "You cannot afford a lawyer, Gary," I stated calmly. "You cannot even afford to pay the suppliers for your sporting goods store. You are here tonight because you need my money to make payroll on Friday. How are you going to fund a multi-year legal battle against a fully capitalized trust when you are already functionally bankrupt?" The words hit him like a physical blow. The bluster drained out of him. The reality of the math suffocated his rage. He had no capital. He had no leverage. He was staring at a $480,000 balloon payment, and he had absolutely no way to satisfy the debt. The silence returned to the apartment. It was heavier this time. It was the silence of total defeat. The emotional chaos of the confrontation settled into the cold, hard facts of the legal snare. They had walked into my apartment expecting to leave with my future. They were going to leave with the certainty of their own ruin. Gary stood in the center of my small living room staring at the floor. The heavy silence stretched between us. He had run out of threats. He had run out of bluster. The realization that he possessed zero leverage finally settled over him like a suffocating blanket. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life manipulating the narrative to serve his own ego. He relied on volume and intimidation to force compliance from the people around him. But you cannot intimidate a legally binding contract. You cannot yell at a recorded deed until it changes its terms. The math was indifferent to his anger, and the math had just backed him into an inescapable corner. I did not offer him a moment to recover. I did not give him the space to formulate a new lie. I reached into the heavy manila envelope one last time. I pulled out the final piece of paper Thomas Gallagher had prepared for me in his downtown office. It was printed on thick, cream-colored stationery bearing the formal letterhead of the law firm. It was not a copy. It was the original document signed and dated by the estate executor. I walked over to the coffee table. The blank wire transfer authorization form Gary had brought with him was still sitting near the edge. It was the symbol of his entitlement. It was the piece of paper he thought would save his failing franchise and fund his country club lifestyle for another year. I placed the formal legal notice directly over his wire transfer form, covering it entirely. "This is your 30-day notice of acceleration," I stated. My voice was clinical and hollowed out of any emotion. I delivered the words with the precise cadence of a professional reading a diagnosis. "You owe the trust $480,000 by the 15th of next month." Gary stared at the cream-colored paper. He did not reach for it. He kept his hands at his sides as if touching the document would make the nightmare real. "If you default on this payment," I continued, maintaining the steady rhythm of my delivery, "I am instructing Mr. Gallagher to initiate immediate foreclosure proceedings on the Carmel property. We will file the paperwork on the 16th. You will be served with an eviction notice shortly after." Susan let out another ragged sob. The reality of the timeline crashed into her. 30 days. It is an impossible window for a couple with toxic credit and a failing retail business to secure $500,000 in liquid capital. They could not borrow against the house because my trust already held the primary lien. They could not borrow against the sporting goods store because the inventory was mismanaged and the suppliers were already halting shipments. They were financially marooned. My mother scrambled up from the cheap sofa. Her cashmere wrap slipped off her shoulders and pooled on the worn carpet. She stumbled around the edge of the coffee table, closing the distance between us. She reached out with both hands and grasped my forearm. Her grip was tight and desperate. "Kaylee, please," she begged. Her voice cracked under the weight of her panic. "You are my daughter. I am your mother. You cannot put us on the street." I looked down at her hands holding my arm. Her nails were perfectly manicured, coated in an expensive pale pink polish. She wore a heavy diamond anniversary band on her ring finger. The scent of her high-end floral perfume filled the space between us. It was a smell I associated with locked doors and hushed conversations. It was the smell of a woman who prioritized her own comfort over the survival of her child. "We will have nowhere to go," Susan pleaded, staring up into my face with wide, terrified eyes. "Gary put everything into the store. Our savings are gone. If you take the house, we will be homeless. Tyler lives in the guest suite above the garage. He does not make enough at the store to afford his own apartment. He will have nowhere to go." She was playing her final card, the maternal obligation. She was hoping that somewhere deep inside me, the frightened 19-year-old girl who just lost her father was still waiting for her mother's approval. She was hoping I would look at her tears and absorb her burden, just like I had done for the last 9 years. She even used Tyler as a human shield one last time, hoping my empathy would extend to the stepbrother who had spent his adult life mocking my frugality. I looked at her face. I did not see a mother. I saw a woman who made a calculated series of choices. I remembered a Tuesday morning 4 years ago. It was late January, and a heavy snowstorm had blanketed Indianapolis. My 12-year-old Honda Civic had a dead alternator, and I could not afford the tow truck. I had to walk 3 miles in the freezing sleet to catch a city bus so I could make it to my shift at the hospital. I called Susan from the bus stop, shivering in a thin winter coat. I asked if she could loan me $200 to get the car fixed. She told me money was tight. She told me Gary was stressed about inventory, and she did not want to burden him with my car troubles. She suggested I learn to manage my finances better. An hour later, I saw a photo she posted on her social media feed. It was a selfie taken from the heated leather driver's seat of her brand new leased Mercedes. She was holding a $6 artisan coffee, smiling brightly. The caption read, "Running errands in a winter wonderland." She had watched me eat store-brand oatmeal for dinner while she hosted catered luncheons. She had watched me sew the torn seams of my work trousers while she complained about the cost of dry cleaning Gary's tailored suits. She had watched me grind down my student debt penny by penny, a debt I only had because she allowed Gary to drain my college fund to renovate a master bathroom. I reached down and placed my hand over hers. I pried her manicured fingers off my forearm. I stepped back, breaking the physical contact. "You made a choice," I told her. The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of a decade of grief. "You chose his ego over my survival. You chose the appearance of wealth over the safety of your own daughter. You let him erase Dad from our lives, and you let him treat me like an inconvenience." Susan shook her head, fresh tears spilling over her cheeks. "No, Kaylee, that is not true. We were trying to build a new life. You built a lie," I corrected her. "And Dad knew you were going to do it. He knew you were going to throw me away the second it became inconvenient to protect me. He just made sure you would eventually have to pay for it." I turned away from her and walked toward the front door of my apartment. The brass deadbolt felt cold against my palm. I turned the lock and pulled the heavy door open. The draft from the hallway swept into the living room. I stood by the open door and looked at the two of them. Gary was still frozen near the sofa, staring at the formal legal notice resting on the coffee table. Susan was standing in the center of the room, her face buried in her hands, weeping openly. The power dynamic that had defined our relationship for 9 years was permanently inverted. They were no longer the affluent parents dictating the terms of my existence. They were defaulting debtors standing in the home of their primary creditor. "Get out," I said. Gary slowly lifted his head. He looked at the open door, and then he looked at me. The rage was gone, replaced by a hollow, vacant stare. He did not issue any more threats. He did not promise to call a lawyer. He knew the paperwork was airtight. He walked over to Susan and placed a heavy hand on her shoulder. He did not bother to pick up his blank wire transfer form. He left it sitting on the table underneath the weight of my father's corporate trap. Gary guided my mother toward the hallway. Susan stumbled, her vision blurred by tears. She did not look at me as she crossed the threshold. Gary avoided my eyes entirely. They stepped out into the dim light of the apartment corridor, leaving the bottle of cheap wine sitting untouched on my kitchen counter. I pushed the door shut. The latch clicked into place with a sharp metallic snap. I slid the deadbolt home. I stood in the quiet apartment and let out a long, slow breath. The radiator hissed in the corner. The traffic outside hummed its familiar tune. Nothing in the room had physically changed, but the entire world had shifted on its axis. The 30-day clock had officially started ticking. They had 1 month to find $480,000 or face public financial ruin. I knew they would not find the money. I knew the facade was going to crumble, and I knew exactly what was going to happen when the pressure of the debt finally cracked their fragile alliance. The silence in my apartment was no longer lonely, it was victorious. Tuesday morning arrived, marking 7 days since the heavy manila envelope hit my cheap laminate coffee table. I drove to the hospital administration building, feeling a strange sense of calm. Medical coding is an exercise in translating chaos into order. A shattered collarbone becomes a 5-digit sequence. A chronic illness becomes a billing tier. There is deep comfort in this structure. I sat at my desk on the 3rd floor drinking generic coffee and found peace in the predictable nature of my dual monitors. Every action in this system has a documented code. Every medical procedure has a specific outcome. The real world operates the same way if you force it to follow the rules. In Carmel, the consequences of my father's rules were playing out in real time. The 30-day countdown clock stood at day 8. The infection was spreading through their carefully constructed lives. The first symptom of the collapse arrived on my phone during my lunch break. I was sitting in my 12-year-old Honda Civic eating a packed sandwich to save money. I checked my voicemail. There was a frantic message from a number I did not recognize, but the voice was unmistakable. It was Tyler, Gary's biological son. Tyler is the boy who moved into my house 9 years ago and turned my father's quiet oak study into a loud media room. He has never spoken to me unless he needed someone to clean up a mess or pass him a beverage. Now his voice lacked the manufactured confidence of a country club legacy. He was shouting into the receiver, his breathing erratic and panicked. Tyler detailed his morning with rapid, breathless sentences. He woke up at 6:00 to the sound of a heavy diesel engine idling outside the guest suite above the garage. He looked out the window and saw a tow truck backing into the circular driveway. The driver hooked thick steel chains to the rear axle of his Ford pickup. The dealership tags were long gone, but the lien holder never forgot the principal balance. Tyler ran out onto the driveway in his pajamas, standing barefoot on the cold concrete. He confronted the driver, demanding he unhook the vehicle. The driver did not argue. He simply handed Tyler a printed default notice, put the truck in gear, and towed the pickup down the street. Tyler blamed me for the empty space in the driveway. He screamed into the voicemail that I froze the family assets. He claimed his credit was ruined because Gary missed 3 consecutive payments on the auto loan and used my refusal to sign the wire transfer as the primary excuse. Tyler demanded I call the bank and fix his life. I deleted the message without finishing his rant. I do not owe a 29-year-old man a vehicle. He can learn the local bus routes. The repossession of the truck was a minor tremor compared to the earthquake hitting the sporting goods franchise. The retail collapse happened swiftly. I did not have to guess the details because Susan sent me erratic emails every evening. I did not reply to a single message, but I read them. They read like the chart notes of a terminal patient fading fast. Gary missed his Friday payroll. You cannot convince retail workers to stock shelves and run cash registers on the empty promise of future capital. When the direct deposits failed to hit their bank accounts, sixth-floor employees walked out the front doors and locked them. Gary attempted to run the registers himself, but a business without inventory is just an empty room waiting for the lights to go out. The local suppliers smelled the panic. The sporting goods sector operates on a fragile margin of trust. When Gary failed to pay his pending invoices, the distributors severed his credit lines. A delivery truck full of winter athletic gear arrived at his loading dock on Monday morning. The driver asked for a certified cashier check before opening the cargo doors. Gary tried to offer a handwritten promissory note. The driver refused to unload a single box, put his truck in gear, and drove away. The shelves remained bare. The store was locked in a vertical tailspin. The $700,000 bailout was the only parachute Gary had, and I kept it packed away in my secure account. His business was effectively dead. Susan is a woman who believes money and status can buy a detour around reality. She believes there is always a regional manager to complain to, or a special exception to be made for people who wear cashmere. When Gary's business started bleeding out, she turned her attention back to the acceleration notice. She decided to fight Thomas Gallagher. On Wednesday afternoon, Gallagher sent me a brief encrypted email update from his downtown office. He detailed Susan's frantic attempts to navigate the legal system. She spent 3 days driving to the most expensive law firms in Indianapolis. She sat in plush leather chairs and handed my father's limited liability company charter to senior partners. She presented the recorded mortgage deed. She tried to frame the acceleration clause as an unfair hidden penalty. She expected these high-priced sharks to find a loophole and tear my legal claim apart. The legal system does not care about her zip code or her flawless makeup. Every single attorney she consulted looked at the airtight structure of DF Holdings LLC. They reviewed the subclauses. They examined the notarized stamps. Then they asked to see the proof of the triggering event. Susan had to hand them the certified transcripts of her own voicemails. She had to show them the text messages where Gary threatened to cut me off if I did not wire him the funds. The attorneys read the definition of financial coercion written by my actuary father 9 years ago. Then they read Gary's exact words confirming the extortion. The legal consultations ended right there. Every lawyer told her the exact same thing. She had no case. The documentation was flawless. My father's math was perfect. The trap was legal, ethical, and binding. Taking this contract to court would only drain whatever meager cash reserves she had left and result in a swift summary judgment in my favor. Gary thought he could manipulate the legal system the same way he manipulated my mother. He learned that the law is indifferent to his ego. The legal system stonewalled them. Susan tried one last desperate maneuver. If she could not beat the acceleration notice in court, she would try to buy her way out of it. She gathered Gary's financial records and drove to 4 different regional banks attempting to refinance the Carmel house. She wanted to take out a new traditional mortgage to pay off the $480,000 balloon payment owed to my trust. A bank underwriter evaluates risk using the same cold logic my father used. They pulled Gary's credit report. They saw the repossessed truck. They saw the failing retail franchise and the commercial vendor defaults. The underwriters also saw a hostile primary lien held by a private corporate entity demanding immediate payment. No underwriter in the state of Indiana was going to touch that property. The title company flagged the house as a toxic asset. The traditional banking system looked at Gary's ledger and locked their doors. The trap my father built 9 years ago snapped perfectly shut. There are no loopholes. There are no extensions. The timeline is shrinking. The 30-day deadline is approaching rapidly, and the pressure is mounting inside the walls of that sprawling house. Desperate people do not just surrender when the legal routes close and the financial avenues dry up. They stop fighting the paperwork, and they start looking for a new target. As I leave the hospital on Friday evening, I notice a familiar silver SUV parked across the street from the employee garage. The windows are tinted, but I know who is sitting behind the wheel. The conflict is moving from the courtroom back to the pavement. Day 28 of the notice period arrived with a heavy gray sky hanging over Indianapolis. The 30-day clock my father built was nearly out of sand. The silence emanating from the sprawling brick house in Carmel was profound. There were no more midnight visits to my apartment alleyway. There were no more arrogant text messages demanding wire transfers. The frantic energy Gary relied on to bully the world had evaporated. In its place was the cold, crushing weight of a $480,000 debt they could not pay. The first official confirmation of their surrender did not come from my mother. It came in a secure email from Thomas Gallagher. I opened the message on my phone while sitting in the hospital break room. Gallagher forwarded a formal communication he received from a bankruptcy attorney representing Gary and Susan Miller. The email was a legal white flag. They were waiving it because they had exhausted every other option. They could not secure a secondary loan to cover the balloon payment. They could not liquidate the inventory of the sporting goods store because the commercial vendor liens were already in place. The bank refused to refinance a property holding a hostile private mortgage. Gary and Susan were financially marooned. To avoid total bankruptcy and a messy public foreclosure, their attorney proposed a short sale of the Carmel property. A short sale requires the primary lien holder to approve the transaction before the house can be listed on the open market. That primary lien holder was DF Holdings, LLC. I had to authorize the sale of my mother's dream home. I printed the authorization forms in the hospital break room and signed them with a cheap blue ballpoint pen. I felt no hesitation. I was simply processing the paperwork. The legal surrender was clean, but the emotional collapse of their household was toxic. I learned the details of their fractured marriage through a voicemail Susan left on my phone at 2:15 in the morning. I listened to it while boiling water for my generic oatmeal the next day. Susan was whispering into the receiver. The performative country club matriarch was gone. I heard the clinking of a glass against a granite countertop. I heard a heavy door slam somewhere deep in the house, followed by Gary shouting an obscenity. Susan was hiding in her luxury kitchen crying over the ruins of her life. She whispered that the marriage was over. The stress of the impending balloon payment had stripped away the polite fiction they lived in. She finally saw Gary for what he really was. He was not a brilliant entrepreneur. He was a financial parasite who used her equity to fund his ego. She told me Gary spent the entire week blaming her for the collapse. He called me a vindictive sociopath and told Susan it was her fault for raising a daughter who would not be a team player. They turned on each other the second the unearned capital ran dry. The corporate structure of our blended family ate itself from the inside out. There was no loyalty left between them, only blame and resentment. The public humiliation followed a few days later. In a wealthy neighborhood like Carmel, a short sale is a loud public announcement of failure. Image is the primary currency in that zip code, and my mother was officially bankrupt. The neighbors who drank Gary's expensive scotch on the back patio would see the listing. The women who sat on Susan's charity committees would whisper about the sudden financial ruin during their catered luncheons. The pristine illusion my mother sacrificed my college fund to maintain was shattered for everyone to see. The local real estate blogs picked up the listing. I viewed the photos online during my lunch break. The property was staged to sell quickly, but it looked hollow. The chef kitchen where Susan cooked dry pork roasts looked sterile. The media room where Tyler used to drop his wet towels was stripped of its giant flat-screen television. Gary was already liquidating their personal assets to pay his retail bankruptcy lawyers. Tyler had been forced to move out of the guest suite above the garage. Without his financed truck or his unearned management position, he was scrambling to find a minimum wage job near a bus line. The safety net Gary provided for his own son was gone. I needed to see the house one last time. I did not want to gloat. I needed to conduct a final visual audit of the situation. I drove my 12-year-old Honda Civic up Meridian Street on a Thursday afternoon, taking the familiar route to their neighborhood. The check engine light was still glowing on my dashboard, but it did not bother me anymore. I turned onto their wide, tree-lined street and drove slowly past the manicured lawns. I did not park in the circular driveway. I drove to the end of the cul-de-sac and parked near a grove of old oak trees. I left the engine running and looked through the windshield at the brick facade. A stark white real estate sign was pounded into the pristine front yard. A red rider was clamped to the top of the wooden post. It read, "Short sale subject to lender approval" in bold block letters. I stared at those words. I was the lender. I held the keys to their exit strategy. I looked at the second-floor window on the right side of the house. That room used to be my father's study. I remembered the day I came home from college and found his heavy oak desk missing. Gary erased David Foster from that room in a matter of days. He replaced a careful, methodical actuary with a loud, arrogant ego. Susan let him do it because she wanted a fresh start without the burden of grief. They spent 9 years pretending I was an inconvenience. They expected me to shrink into the background while they spent my future. I sat in my car with the heater blowing warm air against my face. I waited for a rush of triumph. I expected to feel the vindictive thrill Gary accused me of harboring. I thought I might smile seeing the physical evidence of their ruin. The thrill never arrived. I did not feel joy watching their marriage fracture. I did not feel happiness looking at the real estate sign broadcasting their public humiliation. I just felt a clean, clinical closure. It felt exactly like closing a complex medical chart at the end of a long 50-hour week. The diagnosis was terminal. The treatment plan was executed. The file was archived. The symptoms were managed and the patient was discharged. The paperwork my father drafted 9 years ago did exactly what it was designed to do. It protected the vulnerable, and it exposed the greedy. It forced Gary and Susan to face the mathematical reality of their own actions. They tried to steal from a ghost, and the ghost foreclosed on their entire existence. I put my car in drive and pulled away from the curb. I did not look back at the brick house in the rearview mirror. The trap had snapped shut, and now it was time to collect the pieces of my own life. The trust funds were preparing to clear, and a new foundation was waiting to be built. The short sale of the Carmel house closed on the second Tuesday of December. The real estate market moves quickly when a property is priced for immediate liquidation. A corporate relocation buyer paid cash for the brick home. They did not care about the chef kitchen or the vaulted ceilings. They just wanted the zip code. The title company processed the transaction and wired the funds directly to the primary lien holder, DF Holdings, LLC. The mechanism my father built functioned flawlessly. The $480,000 balloon payment was satisfied in full. The remaining equity left over from the sale was negligible, swallowed by closing costs, and the legal fees generated by Gary's bankruptcy attorneys. Gary and Susan walked away from their sprawling dream home with nothing. Later that same afternoon, Thomas Gallagher initiated the final protocol. The $700,000 resting in the holding account merged with the short sale proceeds. The combined capital cleared into my secure personal accounts. It bypassed Gary's grasping hands entirely. I sat at my desk in the hospital administration building watching the digital ledger update on my phone. The numbers on the screen represented the end of a 9-year siege. I was a medical coder earning $20 an hour. I was now a woman with over $1 million in liquid capital. I did not celebrate. I did not take my coworkers out for expensive cocktails or brag about the windfall. I treated the money with the exact same clinical precision my father used to assemble it. I logged into my federal student loan servicer portal. The balance stood at $42,000. The debt that Gary and Susan forced upon me when they diverted my college fund to renovate their master bathroom. The debt I had been grinding down for 6 years. I linked my new checking account. I typed the full payoff amount into the payment field. I reviewed the confirmation screen. I clicked submit. One single mouse click erased 6 years of anxiety. The digital balance reset to 0. The low hum of panic that lived in the back of my throat every time I opened my mail was silenced forever. I closed the browser tab and returned to my dual monitors, finishing my shift reading alphanumeric billing codes. I did not quit my job. I like the structure of medical coding. I like the predictability of the rules. I also knew that sudden wealth can be just as destructive as sudden poverty if it is not managed correctly. I am the daughter of an actuary. I do not make impulsive decisions. I did not buy a sports car. I did not move to a gated community in Carmel. I stayed true to the practical roots my father instilled in me. I spent the next 3 months researching the housing market in Indianapolis. I wanted stability. I wanted walls that belonged entirely to me. In early March, I closed on a house. It was a modest single-story brick bungalow located on a quiet tree-lined street in Broad Ripple. It was 5 blocks away from the drafty walk-up apartment where Gary tried to intimidate me in the alleyway. The bungalow did not have a circular driveway or a media room. It had original hardwood floors, a reliable furnace, and a small backyard enclosed by a solid privacy fence. It was practical, it was secure, it was impenetrable. I moved in over a weekend. I hired professional movers for the heavy furniture, but I handled the home office myself. The second bedroom had a large window overlooking the street. I painted the walls a calm, neutral gray. I did not purchase a heavy mahogany desk like the one Thomas Gallagher used or the one my father used to own. Instead, I went to a local antique store and found a sturdy wooden desk. The surface was scratched and worn, bearing the marks of previous owners who had actually used it for hard work. It was not a showpiece. It was functional. I set up my dual monitors and my ergonomic chair. I was building my own legacy exactly the way I wanted to build it. I settled into a routine. I worked my coding shifts from the home office. I drank generic coffee from my own kitchen. I paid my utility bills early. I lived a quiet, structured life insulated from the chaos I had left behind. The final echo from that chaos arrived on a Friday evening in late April. I was sitting at the scratched wooden desk reviewing a complex surgical file when my cell phone vibrated. I looked at the screen. The caller ID displayed my mother's name. I had not blocked her number. Blocking felt like an emotional reaction, and I preferred indifference. I let it ring. The notification tone sounded indicating a new text message. I picked up the phone and opened the thread. It was the first direct communication from Susan since the night she wept in my living room. I expected a long, manipulative paragraph detailing her hardships. I expected her to blame Gary, or the economy, or the lawyers. Instead, the message was remarkably brief. 3 sentences. Kaylee, I am so sorry for everything that happened. I should have protected you better. I miss you, and I hope you are doing well. I read the text twice. 5 years ago, an apology like that would have unraveled me. I would have read between the lines, desperate to find genuine maternal affection. I would have drafted a dozen responses trying to find the perfect words to repair the fracture. Now I just saw the underlying mechanics of the message. Susan and Gary were living in a rented townhouse on the south side of the city. Gary was working as a mid-level manager at a logistics company, earning a fraction of what he used to make. Tyler was sharing an apartment with 3 roommates. The country club membership was revoked. The leased Mercedes was returned. The illusion was dead. Susan was reaching out because she was drowning in her new reality. She was not apologizing because she finally understood the depth of her betrayal. She was apologizing because she needed a lifeline. She knew I had the money. She knew the trap had worked. She was sending out a distress signal, hoping the daughter she spent 9 years ignoring would suddenly remember how to be compliant. I looked at the 3 sentences on the glowing screen. I did not feel anger. I did not feel sadness. Some apologies are too late to be anything but a record of regret. They are not an invitation to rebuild. They are simply an acknowledgement of what was broken. I tapped the screen and deleted the message. I did not reply. I put the phone face down on the desk and returned to the surgical file on my monitor. The past was archived. The ledger was balanced. The future was mine to code. I let the deleted text message from my mother vanish into the digital void. The house was quiet. It was the kind of quiet that you earn. It was not the tense, suffocating silence that follows an argument. It was the clean, empty space of a Saturday afternoon where nobody expects anything from you. I closed the medical file on my monitor and powered down the workstation. The scratched wooden desk felt solid under my hands. The work week was over and I had guests arriving in 2 hours. I walked into my new kitchen. The countertops were not imported granite and the appliances were standard grade. But the refrigerator was fully stocked and the mortgage was paid in full. I tied an apron around my waist and began preparing the food. I was hosting my own dinner party tonight. It was the first gathering I had organized since I moved into the brick bungalow. I was not cooking a dry pork roast. I was not trying to impress anyone with the appearance of wealth. I was making homemade lasagna. It was messy, and it took time, but it smelled incredible. At exactly 6 o'clock, the doorbell rang. I wiped my hands on a towel and walked to the front door. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled it open. My guests stood on the small concrete porch holding Tupperware containers and bottles of wine. There were 6 of them, 3 women from the medical coding department at the hospital, a nurse I had befriended during my early years navigating the billing system, and 2 friends from college who had watched me survive the immediate aftermath of my father's death. They were not wearing cashmere wraps or tailored blazers. They wore comfortable sweaters and jeans. They were people who knew the reality of 50-hour work weeks and student loan payments. They were people who showed up when I had nothing to offer them but my company. They poured into the hallway, filling the house with loud voices and genuine laughter. One of my coworkers handed me a bottle of red wine. It was a $15 blend from the grocery store. It was the exact same price point as the bottle Gary had brought to my apartment 6 months ago. But the context changed everything. Gary brought cheap wine as an insult to my intelligence. My friend brought it because we both knew what a budget felt like. The intention behind the gift was what mattered. We gathered around my kitchen island. We did not set a formal dining table with silver and fine china. We ate off ceramic plates and used paper napkins. The conversation was easy. Nobody tried to dominate the room. Nobody pitched a failing business venture or complained about the local country club. We talked about difficult patients, broken hospital policies, and the mundane details of our lives. We talked about survival. As the evening progressed, we moved into the living room. The sun went down, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors. I turned on a warm lamp in the corner. I sat on my sofa listening to the rhythm of the conversation. I looked at the faces around me. This was my found family. They were the people who chose to be here. They were not bound to me by a sense of obligation or a shared legal document. They were here because they valued my presence. I thought about the house in Carmel, the house that belonged to someone else now. I thought about the Sunday dinners where I sat in silence trying to make myself invisible. I thought about the years I spent believing that my worth was tied to my ability to endure their disrespect. The contrast between my past and my present was absolute. I waited for a lull in the conversation. The room quieted down. The sound of clinking glasses faded. I looked directly at the people who had supported me, and then in my mind I looked beyond them. I imagined the thousands of people who might hear my story, the people who are currently sitting at their own hostile dinner tables wondering if they are crazy. If you are listening to this right now, I want you to pay attention. My voice was steady and clear. It was the voice of a woman who had walked through the fire and learned how to control the heat. If you are the scapegoat in your family, listen to me. If you are the one they only call when they need something, you need to hear this. They will always try to convince you that handing over your boundaries is the responsible thing to do. They will frame your compliance as loyalty. They will use the memory of the people you love to make you feel guilty for simply surviving. They will expect you to finance their mistakes while they mock your frugality. I paused, letting the weight of the words settle. A toxic family operates on the assumption that you will always stay small. They rely on your silence. They bank on your fear of conflict. They believe that because they share your blood, or because they married into your life, they are entitled to your future. They are not entitled to anything. Keeping receipts is not petty. Setting firm boundaries is not revenge. It is survival. When you document their behavior, you are building a shield. When you refuse to sign the paperwork they put in front of you, you are protecting your own life. Do not let them rush you. Do not let them panic you. Take a step back and read the fine print. I thought about Thomas Gallagher sitting behind his mahogany desk. I thought about the elegant mathematical trap my father had built. Outsmarting them is not an act of malice. Outsmarting them is just the math of self-worth. You calculate the cost of their demands, and you realize the price is too high. You stop negotiating with people who view you as an asset to be liquidated. You close the ledger, you lock the door, and you build a new foundation entirely on your own terms. The people in my living room nodded. They understood. They had seen the heavy bags under my eyes for years. They knew the cost of the peace I had finally secured. I took a breath. The air in my home was clean and warm. I am Kaylee Foster. I am a medical coder. I am the daughter of an actuary. I survived the erasure of my father, and I foreclosed on the people who tried to steal my future. I kept the table I wanted, and I built the life I deserved. If this story hit close to home, if you recognize the pattern of the demands and the weaponized tears, share this with someone who needs to hear it. Hit subscribe, keep your receipts, read the fine print, and never let them tell you what you are worth. The ink on the deed is dry, and the Carmel house is someone else's problem now. Sitting here at my scratched wooden desk in Broad Ripple, I realize the profound truth of my father's careful planning. He didn't just leave me money. He left me a shield forged from his understanding of human nature. If there's anything you take away from my story, let it be this. First, conditional love is just a business transaction disguised as family. When their affection requires you to sacrifice your future, it's not love, it's extortion. Second, outsmarting toxicity isn't revenge, it's survival. When you document the manipulation and read the fine print, you reclaim the power they assumed you'd surrendered. I didn't need to yell or scream to win my peace. I just needed the courage to let the paperwork speak for itself. The ledger is balanced, and the life I'm building is finally undeniably mine. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to become the paperwork one to survive, hit subscribe, like this video, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. This is Kaylee Foster signing off for Senior Echo Stories. Stay strong and keep your receipts.